Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and adaptive decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, to make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it is my pleasure to welcome back to the show Dr. Paul Taylor. Paul is an assistant professor in the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he studies decision-making, human factors, and system safety in the context of police interactions with the public. Paul has over 10 years of practical law enforcement experience, including time as a department training manager, patrol sergeant, and use of force instructor. Paul is the founder of the Association of Force Investigators and has delivered law enforcement-related instruction for academy, field training, and advanced in-service audiences, as well as graduates and undergraduate level courses. Paul is actively engaged in law enforcement research and training across the United States and internationally. Well, Dr. Taylor, welcome back to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for making the time to come on today.
Oh, Chris, it's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me. And what a great platform you have here, Chris. It's needed, and I'm glad you're doing the work that you're doing.
Well, thanks for that, Paul. It's only helpful because of the willingness of great researchers and academics like yourself that are willing to come on and share the critical research that you're doing to help advance law enforcement training. So I'm equally grateful for that. And Paul, we are going to talk today about a study that you and colleagues published called Lost in Transition: The Effects of Transitioning Between Firearms and Electronic Control Devices on Perception Response Times. And this was published in the Police Journal, Theory, Practice, and Principles. So, Paul, I found this report was incredibly important and timely from a couple perspectives. One is, of course, for trainers, and we're going to talk about that as we go along here, and want to hear your thoughts and implications for this paper on how it should impact law enforcement training, but also for investigations. Just over a year ago, Paul, I was involved in a use of force case as an expert with an RCMP officer who ended up being charged with manslaughter because the original use of force opinion that was written by someone else opined that the officer should have first tried to deploy her conducted energy weapon. And if that then failed, she would have had sufficient time to be able to transition from her taser to her handgun. And of course, this is in a context in which a extremely violent, drug-induced individual was charging at her full speed with full intent to cause her physical harm. And the prosecution relied upon that use of force expert's opinion. It was strongly what led to the charges of manslaughter against the officer. Now, fortunately, after the preliminary inquiry or preliminary hearing, the prosecution recognized that a serious error had been made, and they dropped the charges. But a lot of damage is done, right? Officers being charged criminally because of a lack of bringing research into the real world. And so that's a long intro, Paul, but so let's talk about your study. Okay, first of all, what was the impetus for this? What drove you and your colleagues to want to look at this particular issue?
Yeah, and there was a lot of layers in that intro, Chris, that you just gave, and I was kind of attaching on to some things that you said, and a lot of those things are the reason why we conducted the study. And it's a relatively simple study. I mean, it's not complex at all. It wasn't a complex design, but a lot of us, trainers, attorneys, triers of fact, people who are looking at these cases and making administrative decisions are basing them on essentially what they imagine somebody could do in that situation, right? And so they say, well, maybe they look at a force continuum diagram and they say, well, this officer could have moved up or down this level of force very easily. They should have been able to do that. And really, that diagram is deceptive. You look at a diagram and you say, okay, the next step up is this level, or you could move down a level. And we really haven't put time frames to that to really understand how long does it take an individual to move between these levels, and what is the impact of that time, both on decision making and on their ability to respond. And so that was the impetus for this study, and it's actually a two-part study that we conducted. This is the first part that was published. There's a second part that we looked at as well, but we were interested to start to put some times on that to start to understand, okay, what are law enforcement officers capable of in transitioning between their tools, and specifically between their firearm and their taser.
Okay, and now, Dr. Taylor, is this an area of research that is it vacuous before you undertook this study? Has nobody looked at the transition times and capabilities of officers between weapon systems?
My goodness. And people have looked at perception response times. People have looked at perception response times from holstered positions and from unholstered positions, primarily with a firearm. I'm not aware of any other studies that have looked at perception response times that integrate transitioning between tools. And really, this area of study is wide open in law enforcement. There's very little quality research and very little research at all, to be quite honest, on decision making and how officers interact with their tools and their day-to-day tasks and the impact those have on outcomes. And so I would say, yes, it's vacuous. I call policing the profession that science forgot.
Okay, right. Well, we're grateful for this study then, and I'm just going to read a sentence out of your introduction and ask you a question on it here. You're talking about this type of research. You said this has resulted in a siloed literature made up largely of independent topics like deadly force, electronic control devices, and even de-escalation. These somewhat ironically closely resemble in both name and substance the silos found in modern police training programs. That sounds like a little bit of a provocative statement there. So why don't you tell us what does that mean and why is it important, Paul?
Yeah, well, whether we're talking about police training or police research, it's largely been siloed, and we've, I'll take training first. We've got our firearms program, we've got our defensive tactics program. We typically have taser training, which may last a couple of days. We have our legal, and they're all treated separately. Oftentimes the instructors don't even like each other, right? They won't even talk to each other, and don't want to cross boundaries. And so they're very protective of kind of their fiefdoms and what it is that they do in these individual silos. But we don't do a lot of cross training. And Chris, this is where we see bad outcomes in policing, whether it's things like not rendering aid. Right. So if we really start to break that down after a shooting where officers weren't rendering aid, if we back that up and start looking at the training that was in place at the time, officers were engaged in deadly force training. They were engaged in first aid and life-saving training, but those two never crossed. When they got involved in a shooting in a scenario, it was call scenario in scenario, and life-saving first aid was treated as a completely independent topic. But we saw there was a breakdown in the time frame between officers getting involved in a shooting and other officers starting to render aid to a subject, because those things had not been trained. We never taught those things. And the same goes for things like de-escalation, right? We oftentimes train de-escalation in a void that's not around the other tactical considerations that are there. And we'll see officers put themselves into position that is the best position to de-escalate a situation, but may not be the best position to respond if the de-escalation techniques don't work. And so there's a real need to start looking at combining training, interleaving training, breaking down those silos on the training side. Well, ironically, the same thing has happened in research. We do research, and there's categories of research in deadly force, on intermediate weapons, on de-escalation, but really we're not looking at how all of these things interact and kind of drive the outcomes that we see out on the street. And they do have a big impact on outcomes, and particularly the outcomes that we don't like. When things happen kind of within one of the silos, right? The event doesn't kind of breach a silo. Officers do a really good job in those events. We don't see officers making a lot of mistakes or a lot of errors. It tends to be right between those silos where we start to see decision making start to break down. We see officers kind of get tied up or make a decision that we don't understand in the aftermath.
Right, absolutely. So I think, the important takeaway there in what you just said, Paul, for trainers is that when we train in an uncoupled, siloed, linear type of fashion, we cannot expect the human being that's in a rapidly unfolding, time compressed, high consequence event to somehow magically for their brain to put all these crunch these silos together and have excellent decision making and performance, right?
It never happened, and you'd never train an athlete that way. Imagine trying to train a basketball player the way we train police officers. If you only train shooting from a free throw line, separate from dribbling, separate from PowerPoint after PowerPoint about the rules of the game, how prepared would that person be to go out and actually play a basketball game? They wouldn't be, right? They would not be prepared at all, because they have to integrate all of those things into their decision environment, and then they actually have to understand how the game unfolds. And the same goes for law enforcement officers, right? We train these tools, and oftentimes we even call them tools. I'll give you another tool for your tool belt. Well, ultimately, what we need to be training is decision makers who know how to integrate those tools to produce good outcomes. And I think our training should reflect that. It's good to do individual skills training, but then you got to integrate that skill into the larger decision environment with the other skills that an officer is going to be expected to utilize in that environment.
Right, absolutely. And so you mentioned earlier the spaces. I think you referred to them, the spaces in between these use of force events, sort of those what would you call them? Sort of the interactive areas between one use of force event and another, or one skill and another, one tool and another.
Yep.
In looking at, I mean, in my experiences doing use of force expert work, the vast majority, if not, I can almost say all of the use of force events involve multiple applications of skill application,
Yeah.
right? So this is a very critical issue, because officers are often, whether they're escalating up or de-escalating down in an encounter with a subject, we often have 2, 3, 4 or more different types of use of force applications during that encounter.
Yeah, and the other aspect of this, and we're maybe getting a little off topic, but I think it's important, is we're oftentimes training all of these applications towards success. That is, that when officers are training them, they're training them as if they succeed. And in the real world environment, what we see is that with complexity, these things start to break down. I mean, they may be very good tools in a laboratory environment. They may be very good tools under optimal conditions, but in complexity, they start to break down. And what we see is the application, regardless of the tool, whether it's a beanbag shotgun, a de-escalation skill set that I'm using, a taser, a firearm, what we see is that we don't get the response that officers see in training. And officers are left with that gap between a failure of a tool or a tactic or a device, and having to recover from that and move to something else. And that's where things really start to break down. And the optimal distance for all of these things, distance becomes very important. Time is important and distance is important, but the optimal distance for all of these things is very different, right? And so when you're making decisions based on, say, an ECD in your hand, and you're thinking about deploying that, the optimal distance to deploy that is not the place where you would want to be if that fails, especially if you've got an aggressive individual who may have a weapon or some other object. And so what we see is oftentimes we're making decisions within these silos. If I have the ECD in my hand, I'm making decisions based on that ECD. I put myself in the optimal position to use it. And then we have a failure. And now I'm not in the optimal position to respond to that failure. And that's true for de-escalation tactics. It's true for beanbag shotguns. We see it over and over and over again. But it's moving between these silos and also thinking between these silos that becomes really, really important to driving good outcomes.
Excellent point. Now, you say in your paper here on page 3, you say moving up and down the continuum between the same two categories, for instance, moving from taser to firearm and conversely from firearm to taser, are by default presented as equivalent tasks. There are a number of reasons to believe these tasks, though they are both involve the same tools, are different. So why do you say that? What are the reasons for believing moving up versus moving down the continuum are different with those two tools?
Well, I think the reason that we kind of treat them as the same is that's how they've been presented, and like force continuum models in particular, I think have kind of driven that kind of idea home. And any model is a simplification of the real world, right? We're not getting all of the detail and all of the complexity in there, and so simply moving up or down the continuum appears to be, if you just look at a continuum, the exact same process. Well, it's just as easy to move up as it is to move down. But there are some reasons to believe, even prior to conducting this study, that that's probably not the case. For instance, an officer may choose to holster his firearm, probably wants to holster their firearm before they get any other tool in their hand. On the other hand, you may not make that choice if you're moving towards a deadly force decision. You may decide to just drop the tool if that's the direction that you're going. And so there may be some speed considerations. There's also a training disparity between the two, right? We spend a lot of time on firearms training, probably more than any other skill set in law enforcement, particularly in the academy, until we get to something else, and very little time with, say, the taser that we tested in this case in training. So you may get 2 to 4 repetitions depending on your agency, and you may go through a scenario or two depending on your agency, and that's about it. Honestly, the taser has relied very, very heavily on transfer from firearms training to the operation of their tool. And that may make officers feel comfortable with the tool, but we position it in a different place on the belt. We're typically relying on a different hand, hopefully, in these cases to deploy it. And we don't have the attentional resources in that moment to do it. And so without significant training, that can be problematic. And there's other issues with training to the point of automaticity with both tools, but those are some reasons to think that it's probably not the same moving up or down the continuum when it comes to those two tools in particular.
Okay, that's helpful. And now in your paper here, you talk about, we're still in the introduction, but you talk about the importance, Paul, of resilient tactics, about the importance of designing and implementing resilient tactics. So can you tell us, first of all, like, what does that mean? When we talk about a human being in any environment that is able to make those great decisions in, those quickly occurring, rapidly time compressed, high consequence events, what does resilient mean? So when we say a person has resilient tactics,
Yeah.
what are you referring to?
Yeah, so the example I like to use for that is like a construction worker who works at height and wears a fall harness. Why do they wear a fall harness? And people say, well, it's to keep them from falling, and that's the wrong answer, because you actually go through all the steps of falling when you're wearing a fall harness. A fall harness just keeps you from realizing the damage of that fall. It doesn't keep you from falling. It doesn't keep you from making a mistake. And there's no way for us to design a system or tactics or tools that will keep a human being from making mistakes. But what we should do is design tools and tactics that anticipate human error, right? That anticipate the fact that, you know what, I'm going to guess wrong about what's happening in front of me. I'm going to find myself in the wrong position. I'm going to misdiagnose the intentions of the person that I'm talking with. And our tactics, where possible, not always possible, but where possible, should be resilient enough to respond to that. When I deploy a less lethal tool, regardless of what that tool is, rather than believing this tool is going to be successful, I should anticipate that it's going to change behavior, just not the way I think it will. And if I should have the tactics to respond to that change, again, where possible, right? And it's not always possible. Sometimes we're suddenly thrust into a situation and we're having to catch up to what's happening, and we're having to engage in satisficing decision making. But where we can engineer some resilience into our response, and sometimes that's just fractions of a second, where I can engineer, we can see dramatic improvements in decision making. And I have in some of the research that I've done, just fractions of a second dramatically improves decision making. And by the way, and that goes both ways, both from a public safety perspective, but also for officer safety perspective. And if officers have more time where they can engineer more time, where they can engineer some space into their environment, into their tactics, into their decision making, we see dramatically improved outcomes in that decision making, both from a public safety and an officer safety standpoint.
Absolutely. Great. So now, Paul, this study, then you came up with a couple of hypotheses.
Yeah.
Hypotheses, it's
Yeah.
plural. Is it hypotheses?
Hypothesize,
Okay,
hypotheses. Yeah.
there we go. Anyway, what were those? So you were going to undertake this study to look at transition times between taser and handgun to taser. And so, what did you think you'd see as a result of this research?
So my hypothesis was transitioning from a taser to firearm would be significantly faster than transitioning the other way. And the null hypothesis, which is essentially the hypothesis that we put out there that will basically nullify our own hypothesis, is that those transition times were exactly the same.
I see. Okay. All right. So let's get into the study. Tell us, what did you do? How was the study undertaken?
Yeah, so we had a sample of 139 active law enforcement officers who were recruited from 6 different Arizona agencies, and they were everything from large kind of metropolitan agencies to smaller police departments. The biggest composition of that sample was a large metropolitan agency. We brought the officers in, and our sample was pretty representative of general law enforcement. It was a little light on female officers. It was obviously heavy on Caucasian officers, but overall fairly representative. Primarily patrol officers participating in the study, which we want to see. Those are the ones that are out there using the taser. And we looked at things like their current assignment, last firearms training, last taser training date, and had they ever participated in transition training. We brought them in, and we allowed them to position their firearm and their taser exactly the way that, in fact, they had their own duty belts. They had typically, most of them had their uniforms on, but they had their own duty belts, and they positioned their firearm and their taser exactly the way they carried it. We then put them in front of a Virtua simulator, and the Virtua simulator had a turning target. And we were able to see the moment that the target started to turn, and then the moment that either the firearm or the taser was deployed. It would register those things for us. And so we put them on the line, and we told the officers, we randomly assigned them either a starting position of their firearm out or their taser out. And I believe it was pretty close to 50-50. Handgun drawn was 71 officers, and taser drawn was 68 of the officers started out in that position. And then we instructed them, we said, as soon as you see that target start to turn, as soon as you perceive any change in the target in front of you, we want you to transition as quickly as possible to whichever tool you don't have out. So if they started with their firearm out, we wanted them to transition as quickly as possible to their taser. If they had their taser out, we wanted them to transition as quickly as possible to their firearm. And we asked them to fire one round from either one. So we were asking them to actually engage with the target in front of them. And so the transition times that we saw in this particular study, quite frankly, were sobering, and they were much longer than I thought they were going to be. For firearm to taser, we saw an average time of 4.7 seconds. So we were pushing 5 seconds in transitioning between the two. The range for firearm to taser was 2.475 to 9.374. And then for taser to firearm, the transition time was 2.5 seconds, 2.49 seconds, with a range of 0.811 seconds to 6.865 seconds. Now, one of the reasons it was so much faster is a lot of officers were just dropping their taser on the ground as they were going to their firearm. but there was from a purely qualitative standpoint, it was 100% clear that officers were not at all comfortable transitioning between their tools. And we had asked the officers how many of them had participated in transition training. 70% of them said they had never participated in transition training. Now, that's a little deceptive. It was a yes or no question. I probed a little deeper for some of those that said no, or that they had participated in transition training. And their idea of participating in transition training is they had done one or two scenarios in which both a firearm or a taser might be available to them. So the vast majority of officers had never participated in any type of transition training at all. And so we saw a significant difference in timeframes between them. The other thing that we saw qualitatively is that a number of officers, I believe 2 or 3 officers out of the group, didn't ever get their, or took a long time, initially tried to deploy their taser without flipping the safety off. And so again, clearly not comfortable with the tools, not comfortable transitioning. And there's a couple of things to note here. They knew exactly the stimulus they were looking for. In fact, we demonstrated it for them before they did it. So they knew exactly what was going to happen, and they knew exactly what they were supposed to do in response to that stimulus. So we told them what to look for, and we told them what to do, and we still saw these lengthy time periods between transitioning between tools.
Interesting, and just how that little bit of pressure, even though it's in a laboratory study, can already begin to impair decision making and performance. And you can imagine what that would look like in more of an contextual operational type of environment, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. You've got some interesting information on that. I just want to go back briefly to a second about the setup. So the simulator that was used, so this was, I believe it was a Vertra simulator. Is that correct?
Yes, a Vertra 300. Yep.
Vertra 300 simulator. And so you had the image of the target, silhouette type target on the simulator, and it would turn, and the turning of the target was the cue or the condition with which those officers then had to, as soon as they recognized the target turning, they had to begin a transition from, if they started with their firearm out, they would transition to the taser and vice versa.
Yes.
It says here that the firearm that they had was a Glock handgun, and the taser was an X2. And so the only question I had reading through it was, were those two weapons the standard weapons that those officers always carried?
Yes. And their setup was the same. So and again, wherever they carried those tools, that's where they put them. We did have one officer who was excluded from the study. In fact, he was Canadian. He was visiting to take a class, and he did not have his setup. But other than that, all the other officers had their own duty belt and their own setup for where they carried their tools.
Okay, figures a Canadian would be a problem. All right.
He was very polite. He was very polite about it, though, Chris.
Well, I'm sure he was. Yes. So did the officers, Paul, were they told they had to remain stationary while they were doing the transition? Did you see officers trying to move? What happened there?
We did see a significant amount of movement. We didn't tell them that they had to stay stationary, but that movement was primarily associated with trying to figure out where their tools were. And really, you would see everything from people going from kind of a position, kind of a solid shooting stance, to a position of standing flat-footed, both feet together, looking at their waistband, trying to figure out where those tools are. And as you and I know, that focus of attention coming down to the waistband can have catastrophic implications for both the officer and the subject that they're dealing with, because that even momentary lapse in attention has a dramatic impact on well, things can be happening, but it also has a dramatic impact on performance. And you know, the kind of the example I like to use is my son learning to play soccer for the first time. He wasn't comfortable dribbling the ball, right? Not at all. And so where is his focus of attention entirely? It's on dribbling the ball. And he's not making good decisions about what's happening up here. He's trying to do his best with his brand new skill set, down at his feet. And that means it's very easy to steal the ball from him. It means that he's not seeing where other players are to pass it. It means the game is happening much faster around him, because every time he puts his head up, things have changed dramatically. Well, we see the same type of thing happen in use of force encounters when an officer's focused attention has to go to their tools. They don't have the attentional resources to keep up here with what's going on. There are dynamic changes, and then the officer feels like they're catching up, or they make an unfortunate error in that they start driving forward a response. Things have changed, but that response is already gone. And we saw that in some of the follow-up work that we did. But that dynamic movement tended to be associated with what appeared to be a discomfort with their tools, their arrangement, and trying to find them in the middle of transitioning.
Right. And so that we often refer to that as moving from an external to an internal focus of attention. And you previously mentioned, Paul, the importance of, I believe you used the term automaticity. And so maybe just tell us, like, what is that meant in the research world when an individual has trained to a level of automaticity?
I mean, again, probably the best example of that is driving. So most of us have driven quite a bit, to the point that we really don't have to pay attention to our driving processes. And what happens when we no longer have to pay attention to our tools is that we're able to devote our attentional resources outward. And in the context of driving, that means we're making better decisions about driving. It means we're not paying as much attention to our tools or a task. So basically, automaticity means that we've trained a skill set to the point that we no longer have to devote significant attentional resources to that tool set. There's some cost to that. The cost is that we may not have a memory for carrying out those functions after the fact, but it means that we're able to devote more of our attentional resources outward, and typically we want that during a use of force encounter, because people are then making the best decisions they can about behavior rather than trying to make decisions about their tools. We only have limited attentional resources, and once we've devoted our attentional resources to one thing, we have less to give to other things. And there's some debate as to whether or not we can divide our attention between two things, or we rapidly shift between two different things. But we can divide our attention, but the cost of dividing our attention means that we have less attention for both tasks, and we see a degrade in the performance of both of those tasks. And so again, going back to driving, right, I can talk and drive at the same time, right? I'm really good at talking, really good at driving. I can do both at the same time. But if I suddenly have to take evasive action, what happens to that conversation? I'm no longer able to carry it on. I have to devote all of my attentional resources to driving. And so we see this similar type of situation occur during a use of force encounter. We want those attentional resources outward on what's happening, and we want the tools as much as possible to be to the point of automaticity. Again, there's some costs to that, particularly when you have tools that are designed and function very similarly on your tool belt. But we want those attentional resources out towards the behavior or the stimulus, and making the best decisions possible.
Right. Okay. And so then in this study, Paul, you said you saw a large percentage of the officers that did not have automaticity, obviously. So were they looking for their holsters? Were they looking down at their equipment? Like what gave you the impression that there was the wrong focus of attention?
One, we got a lot of fumbling. So we had officers that were kind of padding around looking for things, and then you actually saw heads come down and start looking for their tool belt. Very low cost to doing that when you have a static target in front of you where there's not a lot of dynamic change. But in our follow-up study that we'll be talking about in a few minutes, where there was dynamic change and they were responding to an individual, we saw the cost that actually takes on decision making and outcomes. And again, it's a two-way street. It's both from an officer safety standpoint and from the safety of the individual that they're dealing with.
Right. Okay. And so how did you measure perception response time in this study? Like what were the two end markers? You said, I think the end of it was when the laser from either the taser or the handgun emitted on the screen. But what was the beginning time when you started calculating?
It was the first frame of movement based on the virtuous simulator, and the virtuous simulator calculates that at the first frame of movement for their stimulus.
Okay, and so that would be the first frame of movement of the target when it
Yep.
began to turn.
Yes.
Okay, so that was the starting fence line, and then the end was the point at which the officer were either able to fire the taser or fire the handgun after transitioning.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and those time frames again, just to repeat that. So you said the average time frame if an officer started with the firearm out to transition from the firearm to the taser was 4.7 seconds, and to transition from the taser to the firearm was 2.49. Now,
That's correct.
okay, you mentioned a couple things I want to unpack here a little bit. I think there's a lot of really important ahas in those numbers. So what percentage of the officers do you think were dropping the taser? Because that's what I can envision. I can envision officers, especially under more realistic pressure, just dropping that taser in order to draw their firearm, because the brain is just going to push forward that critical life-saving response, and it doesn't care about getting
Yeah.
the taser in the holster. So how many of those officers just threw the taser?
Uh, Drew, drop the taser.
Yeah.
Significant number. We didn't track that data specifically, but I would estimate 80 to 90% just drop the taser right off the bat. A few officers kept the taser in their hand, so they would just retract it, and we tracked that in a follow-up study in which we looked at whether or not the officers had both in their hand. But in this particular study, a few officers had both in their hand, and then some of the longer ones that we saw taser to firearm, they actually reholstered and went back to their firearm.
Okay, and the longer ones, and looking at here, you were almost pushing 7 seconds,
Yep.
6.8 seconds at the outset. And so those officers that did end up with both the taser and their firearm in their hands, was it did they obviously they must have transitioned then the taser from their dominant to their non-dominant hand when they drew the handgun? Is that what happened?
It really depended. So, and we saw every configuration on the belt, right? So we saw everything from vest carried tasers to strong side taser to support side, strong side or strong hand draw to support side draw. So we saw the full spectrum. And we did see some officers that started strong side and then transitioned and came out with strong side firearm. So we
Okay.
saw the full spectrum.
Sure. Okay. And then the officers, Paul, who transitioned from the firearm to the taser, did any of them just drop the firearm, or was it pretty substantial that the majority of them did holster before transitioning?
We had one officer drop the firearm, and said "oops" after they after they dropped it.
Okay.
So it was but yeah, we did have one officer drop the firearm in this particular part of the study.
Okay. And so all the others, and that was an accident then, so it was unintended. So all the other officers in this study, so 138, I believe,
Yeah.
holstered their handgun. Now, in watching that, did you get some kind of a qualitative perception on either their proficiency or lack of their proficiency of rapidly holstering their handgun?
Yeah, it was pretty clear that a lot of them kind of had the philosophy of fast out, slow away, and so they again appeared very very uncomfortable. Saw a couple people miss their holster altogether as they were trying to slide in the first time. Saw a couple sights get caught as they're starting. So very very clear, again, not very comfortable, very comfortable with the firearm draw, and so very smooth draw, not very comfortable putting it away, especially putting it away rapidly, under any kind of speed. Yeah, and I think the other thing that we noticed is as I'm thinking back to it is just there's a clear, as you have that goal conflict kind of emerge in getting one out fast and getting one away, you could almost see both hands dividing, especially for when you had a support side draw, and it was almost as if they're trying to do two things at once rather than kind of a smoother action. It was very, very clear that very, in fact, going from firearm to taser, officers were extraordinarily uncomfortable with the movements and the processes of doing that. And again, they lost their stance. That was very interesting to me. That the kind of base stance that you see officers take both with the taser and the firearm, that solid shooting stance, oftentimes would come together. They would just be squared up as they were kind of looking for the tools on their belt.
Yeah, okay. So I'm listening to you, Paul, and one of the things that's just screaming at me for as far as a trainer goes is, when we think about the reality, if we go inside the motor cortex of the brain and understand that motor skills are laid down in the brain at the speed with which we practice them, and then we look at the hundreds, if not thousands of repetitions that an officer gets with their firearm, and that is almost always putting that firearm away slow and deliberately, slow and deliberately, slow and deliberately. And now they're under some pressure to have to get that gun away quickly. And we end up with, like you saw, massive chokes, performance chokes because of that. So do you think then one of the takeaways for trainers should be, look, we if we actually are serious about teaching transition skill, we need to put our officers into contextual drills, micro simulations, and environments where they have to be able to perform getting that handgun away extremely quickly in a variety of different positions.
Absolutely. And this goes to hands-on too, right? If I need to get this firearm away and up on hands-on, I don't want to be looking down, right? This typically means that somebody's closing the distance on me, and I need to get this away, and I need to get both hands up and engaged. I think this comes back to how we train. And we train in the silos. We tend to train towards range safety, which I understand that. But these environments require decision making that goes above and beyond that, and so we've got to take our officers in those directions. And so yes, getting that firearm away quickly, transitioning between skill sets, whether those are verbal skills, they're tactical. So again, verbal skills, and I want to hit on this really quickly. It's an area that I'm looking at right now. Going back to that driving example that I gave, you can't talk and take evasive action at the same time. And how often are we training? We see officers give those beta commands during use of force encounters, and people have said that's a training scar. I think it has far more to do with their focus of attention in the moment, and the fact that they don't have attentional resources for giving verbal commands in that moment. And so transitioning between tools and verbal commands and hands-on is critically important. And yes, so I would say getting that firearm away, transitioning to other things is really, really, really important. It's clearly neglected.
Sure. Good. Thank you. So, Paul, did you measure the accuracy at all? So when they fired either the taser or the handgun, were you looking at did they hit what they
Yeah.
were shooting at, or was it just when the laser came on?
We get it was when the laser came on. We didn't measure it beyond the single shot. We made it a pretty easy target for them. It's a little deceptive when you look at our study. It was very close to them, and they were not far away from the screen. So we wanted it to be a fairly easy shot for them to make, so that they weren't having to think too much about the shot. But if you're putting some distance or you're putting any movement on that, you're going to see more time.
Okay. All right. And more time and probably terrible accuracy.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, let's get into the important part here now, which is the discussion, the implications, Paul. So let's talk about the implications. What can you tell the trainers and investigators that will be listening to this? What are the important application pieces from your study? You've got the ear of trainers and investigators. What's the implications from this?
So one of the first implications is understanding the reality of being able to transition between tools. I think oftentimes we imagine what officers are capable of, and oftentimes it's because we think we would be capable of something under particular circumstances. But that's a biased perspective. And what we need to understand is that under ideal circumstances, when officers know what stimulus to expect, and know what response they're supposed to give, we still see extraordinary amounts of time under the current training standards. I think we can improve on some of those timeframes in transitioning between tools, but there's some cost to that. I don't know if now's a good time to talk about it, Chris, but we did some follow-up research on this, and we actually put them into scenarios in which they had to respond to an individual. And again, we limited them to two options. They could respond to what was happening in front of them with their firearm, or they could respond with their taser. So we only gave them two options, and then they were presented with one of four randomly assigned scenarios. It was an individual who was walking back and forth without a knife, and then approach the subject or approach the officer saying, "I'm going to kick your ass," right? And walk straight towards the officer. Or it was an individual who was walking without a knife, produced a knife, and walked straight towards the officer and said, "I'm going to kick your ass." Or it was an individual who started with a knife, dropped the knife, and approached the officer and said, I'm going to kick your ass. Or it was an individual with a knife who kept the knife and walked towards the officer and said, "I'm going to kick your ass." Now, when the person started with no knife and ended with no knife, no officer made a mistake. They all engaged the individual with a taser. They were clean shots. The individual went down, no issue. The person who started with a knife and ended with a knife, no issue. The officers were able to make good decisions. They decided to engage the individual with deadly force, and they made good decisions there. But when there was transition, so when there's transition between the two, when the person moved from a knife to no knife, or the person moved from no knife to knife, we saw a huge increase in error. And so we had about 140 officers that participated in this second portion of it. 8 of them shot an unarmed subject. All of them they completely missed the knife drop. Why did they miss the knife drop? Because they were so busy transitioning between tools. Failed to transition to a firearm for an armed subject. 6 officers weren't able to transition to a firearm for an armed subject. They kept the taser out as the subject closed the distance, or they attempted to transition. They weren't able to transition. Failed to secure a firearm for an unarmed subject. 4 subjects out of 140. Both taser and firearm in hand for an unarmed subject. So we didn't even count it if it was an armed subject. We said, you know what, if this is a deadly force situation and you have both out, we're not going to say that's an error. That may have been a calculated decision. But if you had both out for an unarmed subject, we said, you know what, that's probably an error. One person did that. Failed to disengage the taser safety despite attempted deployment. 7 officers did that. And so out of 140, and it's actually about half of that actually, so the error rate's higher, 19% made a major error when they were transitioning. So we're actually looking at closer to 40% made a major error when they tried to transition between their tools. Now, why is that happening? It's happening because their focus of attention goes down to their tool belt, and they're missing cues about what's happening, behavioral cues about what's happening in front of them, and it starts to break down. So not only are there time frame issues here, there are attentional issues, and you would never want a quarterback paying attention to how he's holding the football or his stance. You want the quarterback making the best decisions possible about what's happening in front of him in the field, and so it's very, very clear from a training standpoint that we have not trained officers to the point of comfort with their tools that they're able to devote their attentional resources downrange. The other implication from a time frame standpoint is in thinking about deployments. So with the current models, Taser 10 excluded, we're not having kind of conversation around that, but with current models of Taser that are out there and being used a lot, the deployment distance for the Taser is what, 15 feet up to 21 feet, but the average deployment in the field is about 5 to 7 feet, right? So we're getting very, very close. Understanding how long it's going to take to transition to another tool, failure rate aside on the Taser, uh, how long it's going to transition to another tool, officers really need to be thinking about the situations that they put themselves so close to a subject, and what other resources, or how can we deploy this in a way that we can keep that officer safe if that officer does have to transition, or if this does become a situation in which a taser is no longer the appropriate option. It takes time, and it's real time, and officers should be trained on the fact that you know, the average gunfight is 3 seconds long. It's going to take you 2.5 seconds to move from your taser to your firearm on average, and there's a range in there.
Right. Okay. And do you think then also in your earlier comment, Paul, about training to failure and the importance of resilience? So not only transitioning between taser and firearm, but also if an officer has their taser out and you've got that 5 to 7 foot distance where you've attempted a deployment and it's been unsuccessful, you may need to go immediately to hands-on combat with your taser in your hand. And that is something that I really have not seen trained really anywhere. But again, it's when we look at making an officer a good combat system, right, that's able to use all their tools, all their skills integrated together. Would that not speak to the importance of training through that failure as well?
Absolutely. Training through failure, training in anticipation of failure. And you know, I would tell Axon, design your tool for perfection. But we should be training for failure, and that's for everything. That's for your straight arm bar takedown that works perfectly on the mats, right? Over and over and over again. We should be training officers for failure. What happens when this does inevitably fail, when you put your hands on somebody out on the street, and you've closed that distance, and now you touch this person and you realize, I'm not going to move this guy, and now I'm engaged with an individual where if I had thought, you know what, if this fails, I don't want to be touching this guy, right? I want to be at distance. I want to be in a different situation. So thinking those processes through and really training for failure rather than training for success. All the law enforcement training that I went through, and I can say this unequivocally, all the law enforcement training I went through in all the silos train towards success. These de-escalation techniques will be successful. This armbar takedown will be successful. This taser will be successful. And I would experience it, and it would be successful on me in that environment. But we should be training officers with the conception that this will not be successful, and do I have the capacity to respond when it's not? It's not to say they're not effective tools. They're all of these things we're talking about can be extraordinarily effective under the right circumstances, but do I have the ability to respond if this doesn't go the way I want it to with this particular tool?
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So are there other implications that you would want to tell trainers or investigators as far as how we can make our officers better or understand these events, maybe through more of a research-based lens?
I'm a huge advocate for micro experiments within our agencies. We should be practicing these things and working on these things. This is an example, and you should be, and it's published and it's out there. But you should be doing these things in the training environment, and you really should be understanding how long does it take to move between these tools in scenarios where are officers kind of getting stuck in areas, setting up, you know, so often I've heard people say, well, we don't want our officers to fail in training. Well, we do want our officers to fail in training. We do want them to make errors in training, because that's how we learn. If I said, I'm going to go out and teach my son to ride a bicycle, but he's never going to fail, right? He'd never learn to ride a bicycle. You have to fail, and failure is the best learning tool that you have, but it's also indicative of what we're going to see in real life. None of these tools work effectively 100% of the time, and we should be assessing what was your response after the fact. So looking at these things, designing micro experiments to understand how officers transition and move between tools and tactics, and really breaking down those silos in training. You got to integrate these skills. Why don't people cuff under power, right? When they tase, it's because we don't train cuffing under power. We train cuffing and we train taser. And so what happens when we get a taser deployment? Everyone stands around and watches the person suffer through that 5-second cycle. and we all stand back and watch it happen. Why? Because that's all we've done in training. We've watched our recruit buddies go through, and we've watched cycle after cycle after cycle. We've never trained to the point of what comes next. And so breaking down those silos, integrating skill sets, when somebody's closing the distance, putting my holster away, training, shooting to reality, right? As an instructor, I should never be saying you have 4 seconds, you should take all 4 seconds to fire your gun. There's no time in the real world where an officer has 4 seconds to fire 4 rounds. It's not realistic. Don't train to a fabricated test that doesn't replicate what officers are going to face in the real world, because that's what that's going to be their performance when they get out there, and it's going to fall apart.
Right, absolutely. And it will fall apart because, as we know, under life-threatening conditions, the brain is simply going to be trying to push forward the response at the speed it's needed. And so, to your point, if we've trained it at the speed of qualification, and now the brain's trying to scramble and get us to respond at the speed of survival, we can end up with massive performance failures.
Yeah, and we call it condition black. But going back to my son playing soccer, right? The first time he got the ball at his feet, where did he run? He ran straight to the opposing goal, and he most beautiful strike in the world, scored on his own goal. Didn't hear anybody yelling from the sidelines, right? We were screaming, no, no. Didn't hear any of that. My son was in condition black, or was he? It wasn't condition black. It's that his focus of attention was on a brand new skill set that he had never applied in the real world, and because it was there, didn't hear anything else happening around him, didn't see anything else happening around him, and he scored on the wrong goal. Now, with training, as that skill set improved, focus of attention came up, started making good decisions in the game environment, and now we've got somebody who can integrate that skill set into the decision environment and make much better decisions.
Right, right. And so I hope at least it was an incredible kick, and I'm sure it was a proud father moment to see your son score on his own team. All right. So, Paul, we're coming up on an hour here, and but is there anything that you'd want to say? I want to well, I know what I want to ask you. You mentioned the subsequent study that you did with the more realistic context. So can we be expecting a publication coming out with that, and what should we be looking for?
That's a plan, and we're really looking at error rates driven by having to transition between tools. We're still working on a title for that, but that hopefully will be coming out in the next year or so.
Perfect. Well, we'll definitely keep an eye out for that, and when that's published, we'd love to have you back onto the Trainer's Bullpen to talk about that as well. And so, Paul, is there anything else coming off your workbench that we should be aware of, or that you're free to talk about?
Got a lot of work going on. We're working really on the interview side, and what we learn from officers, and how we learn from officers after the fact. There's a lot there, and trying to unpack that in a kind of a larger form written piece. But we're continuing to do work, Chris, and appreciate what you're doing as well.
Well, thank you, Paul, and we appreciate the efforts of you and your colleagues to continue to advance law enforcement training. We do realize that research in law enforcement there's not a lot of good research that's being done. And so when it is by yourself and your colleagues, we're very appreciative of it, because we know you're not in it for the money, or you'd be doing research into some other topic. Well, we won't go down that road, but we've been talking with Dr. Paul Taylor about his study called Lost in Transition, the effects of transitioning between firearms and electronic control devices on perception response times. And this was published in the Police Journal, Theory, Practice, and Principles. Paul, if our listeners want to reach out to you and contact you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Probably email is the best way. My email address is paul.taylor@forceinvestigators.com.
Great. Perfect. All right. Well, Dr. Taylor, thanks again for your time.
Hey, thank you, Chris. Appreciate the work you're doing. Look forward to talking to you next time.
Absolutely.